right. So today we're diving into, well, it's kind of messy. It's Meta's decision to just ditch third-party fact-checking.
Yeah, on Facebook and Instagram.
Hmm.
And we've got, let me tell you, a ton of different voices, different perspectives. We've got Zuckerberg himself. We've got Meta's own oversight board, and they are not happy.
Not happy at all.
And then we've got, the usual tech folks like Kara Swisher chiming in.
Always got to hear from Kara.
Oh, absolutely. And then lurking in the background of it all, we've got, well, Trump and Elon Musk. It's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. It really seems like this whole thing is, well, kind of a symptom of a much bigger issue,
Yeah.
Like these tech platforms, they're just constantly struggling, trying to find that balance between, letting people say what they want, but also, like, keeping things responsible, keeping things under control.
Right. So Zuckerberg's saying this is all about giving users more power, right? Pushing back against what he calls political bias in fact-checking.
Political bias. But I don't know, it feels like, maybe reading between the lines a little bit, that he's playing right into the hands of, well, all those folks that keep saying that social media is censoring them.
Yep.
Especially the conservative voices out there.
Yeah, you're right. That's been a growing narrative for a while now. This idea that conservative voices are being silenced. It's interesting, isn't it? It's like Zuckerberg saw that narrative building and thought, all right, let's tap into that. And, maybe even try to get back in good with people like Trump, who, well, we all know how vocal he's been about being banned.
Yeah. And speaking of big personalities, we can't forget Elon Musk, right? What he's done with X, used to be Twitter, he's really shaken things up with this whole free speech absolutist thing.
Yeah. And, it's had its consequences. Look at what happened to their ad revenue. It just plummeted. Makes you wonder, is Zuckerberg really thinking this through? Is he playing with fire here? Yeah, it's a risky move. It really is. Because advertisers, they care about their image. They don't want to be associated with a platform that's known for being full of misinformation or hate speech. And if that starts happening on Facebook and Instagram, well, they could see what happened to X happen to them. Users leaving, advertisers fleeing. And that hits them where it hurts, right in the wallet.
Ouch. And some analysts are saying it could be billions of dollars lost.
Billions.
But it's not just about money, right? There's this fundamental tension between letting people speak freely and, well, preventing actual harm.
Mm.
And Meta's oversight board, the ones who are supposed to be keeping an eye on things, they're really worried.
Yeah, and they've got every right to be. Helly Thorning-Schmidt, she's the co-chair, and she's been very clear about how worried they are. She's basically saying that without professional fact-checking, things could get really bad, especially for vulnerable communities, like LGBTQ plus folks, people advocating for gender and trans rights.
Yeah, it sounds like she's worried that hate speech could just explode.
Exactly. And we've seen what happens when that hate spills over from online to the real world. It's not just words on a screen. It can lead to, well, real harm, harassment, discrimination, even violence. Like, remember Gamergate, how online platforms were used to target women in the gaming industry. That's what we're talking about here. This is serious stuff.
Okay, so there are definitely some alarm bells ringing. But before we get into all that, I kind of want to go back to the basics for a minute. Like, how did this fact-checking system even work before? And what's Meta replacing it with? They keep talking about community notes, but how reliable are those going to be?
It's a good question. So before, Meta was working with all these independent fact-checking groups all around the world. They had trained journalists, researchers, people who knew what they were doing. And they had these guidelines they followed to, check if something was true or not. If something was flagged, they'd look into it. And if it was false, they'd put a label on it. They'd give people more context, links to real sources, all that. So it was a system, a real system. And now it feels like they're just saying, hey, users, you figure it out. But are people, really ready to be the truth police? Especially with all the fake news and deep fakes and everything else going around.
It's a big ask, isn't it? Because these community notes, anyone can add them. It's like crowdsourced fact-checking.
Mm-hmm.
Meta's idea is that if enough people agree on something, then it must be true.
Mm.
And, they say this is more transparent, more democratic. But can it really keep up with all the misinformation out there? Especially the stuff that's, well, intentionally designed to mislead people. That's the big question. Yeah. It feels like we're all just going to be wandering around this digital Wild West, trying to figure out what's real and what's not. And, most people are just trying to connect with their friends, share a funny meme. They don't want to be doing all this detective work.
Exactly. And how do you even make sure those community notes are accurate? How do you stop people from using them to push their own agenda? And what about harassment? What if people get attacked for disagreeing? There are a lot of potential problems here.
A lot of problems. And it doesn't seem like Meta has it all figured out.
Mhm.
So what about the oversight board? They were supposed to be the independent watchdogs, right?
Mhm.
But they were also, well, Zuckerberg's idea in the first place.
Mhm.
Can they actually do anything in this new anything goes world?
It's tricky because they were set up to have some power. They could overrule Meta's decisions, give them policy advice, but they're also funded by Meta. And the guy who came up with the idea, Nick Clegg, well, he's not even with the company anymore.
So their future's kind of uncertain, especially since they're not happy about this whole fact-checking thing.
Right. And some people are saying that the board was just a PR stunt from the beginning. A way to look like they cared about accountability without actually giving up any control. And now, with this decision, those criticisms are getting louder. It's not a good look.
It's not. It's almost like Meta is trying to walk this tightrope.
Yeah.
They want to make the people who are yelling about censorship happy, but they also don't want their platforms to turn into, well, complete chaos. But it's not just about keeping users happy, right? They also need to keep the advertisers happy.
Absolutely. And that's where the money comes in. Because if Meta loses the trust of advertisers, they're going to feel it. We saw it with X. If Facebook and Instagram start looking like unreliable places full of misinformation, the advertisers are going to go somewhere else. And that's going to hit Meta's bottom line hard.
So Zuckerberg's big gamble on free expression, it could backfire in a big way.
It could. It really could. And it's not just about the money. Think about the impact this could have on everyone. If these platforms become havens for misinformation and hate, it's going to affect how we talk to each other, how we make decisions. It could even affect, our sense of reality.
Okay, so we've got some big things to think about here. But before we go any further, I think we need to talk about, well, the elephant in the room, Donald Trump and Elon Musk.
Yes. The two titans of tech and politics.
Exactly. And their influence on all of this, it can't be ignored. I mean, Trump, he's got this whole history with social media, right? Banned from multiple platforms after January 6th. And he's already saying that this move by Meta proved he was right all along about censorship.
He has. And that just adds fuel to the fire, doesn't it? It makes the whole debate even more heated, and it makes you wonder what Zuckerberg's real motives are. Some people think he's hoping to get Trump back on his platforms, maybe before the next election.
Which would be, a huge deal.
Yeah.
And super controversial. And then there's Musk. He's basically turned X into, a free-for-all. And it almost feels like other platforms are looking at that and thinking, well, we better loosen up our rules too, or we'll be left behind.
It's like a race to the bottom. And Musk, he loves to present himself as this champion of free speech, but a lot of people are saying he's just making a space for hate speech and misinformation to flourish. And the fact that X is losing money, well, it suggests that advertisers aren't buying into his vision.
Yeah. Zuckerberg might want to take note of that before he goes too far down that same road.
He might, because the consequences could be huge for Meta and for all of us.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we're just getting started. Next, we're going to dive deeper into how this could impact vulnerable communities. We'll talk about the political side of things, and we'll look at the arguments for and against this whole shift in how content is moderated.
It's important to remember that even before Meta made this decision, people were already worried about bias in their content moderation. Like, were they targeting certain groups more than others?
Yeah, it was kind of like some people felt like the rules weren't being applied fairly. And now, without those professional fact checkers, it's like they're just throwing the whole system out the window and saying, hey, users, good luck figuring out what's good.
Exactly. And that's where things get really worrying for those communities that are already facing discrimination and hate. Without those checks and balances, it's just going to be easier for those harmful messages to spread.
Yeah. And Hella Thorning-Schmidt, she specifically mentioned LGBTQ plus individuals and people advocating for gender and trans rights as being especially at risk. Why? Why those groups in particular?
Well, sadly, those communities have a long history of being targeted online. Harassment, hate speech, disinformation campaigns, you name it. And it's not just online either. It can lead to real-world consequences.
Yeah, like all that anti-trans legislation we've been seeing. It's scary how online rhetoric can turn into real-world harm.
Absolutely. And those fact-checking labels, even though they weren't perfect, they at least gave people a heads up that something might not be true. Without them, it's going to be that much harder to fight back against these harmful narratives.
So Meta might say this is about free speech, but it's also about protecting people who are vulnerable to abuse, both online and offline.
Right. It's about making sure that everyone feels safe to speak their mind without being attacked or silenced. And it's about making sure that these platforms don't become, well, breeding grounds for hate and lies.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? But I think we both agree the stakes are incredibly high.
They are. And that brings us to, well, the political elephant in the room. What does all of this mean for our elections, for our democracy in a world that's already so divided?
Yeah, we talked about Trump and Musk earlier, but let's really dig into that a bit. We're heading into a major election year, and misinformation is already a huge threat. Could removing fact-checking make things even worse?
It's definitely a concern. I mean, we've seen how quickly false information can spread online and how it can influence people's beliefs and behaviors. Without those fact-checking mechanisms in place, it's just going to be easier for bad actors to manipulate voters and sow chaos.
And you mentioned Trump might come back to social media. If he does, can these platforms handle him? I mean, he's not exactly known for being a beacon of truth and civility.
That's putting it mildly. His history on social media is, well, let's just say it's not exactly reassuring. He's used those platforms to attack his opponents, spread conspiracy theories, and even incite violence.
And it's not just him, right? It's his whole network of supporters. They amplify his messages. They create these echo chambers where facts don't seem to matter anymore.
Right. And those algorithms, they just make it worse. They feed people more of what they already believe, even if it's not true. It's a recipe for disaster.
So even if Meta takes down a post that's false, it might have already gone viral, done its damage. And without those fact-checking labels, it's even harder for people to know what to believe.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Except the haystack is on fire and the needles are poisoned.
That's a pretty vivid image.
Well, that's what it feels like sometimes. Like we're drowning in misinformation and there's no one to throw us a life preserver.
So by ditching fact-checking, is Meta actually helping those who want to undermine democracy?
I don't think it's that simple, but it's definitely a valid concern. They're playing a dangerous game, and it's not clear what the consequences will be.
Yeah. It's not just about politics either. We need to think about the power these platforms have over our lives in general. They shape what we see, what we think, what we buy.
It's true. And this whole debate raises some big questions about corporate responsibility, about privacy, about the role of technology in our lives. We've got to start thinking more critically about how these companies are using our data and what kind of world we want to live in.
It's like we've created these amazing tools, but now we're not sure if we can control them.
Exactly. And the stakes are higher than ever.
Okay. We've talked about the mechanics of fact-checking, the impact on vulnerable communities, the political landscape. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to address, and that's the free speech debate.
Yes. The age-old question. Where do we draw the line? How do we protect free expression without letting things spiral out of control?
It's like Zuckerberg saying, hey, free speech.
Yeah.
Like this is a victory for letting people say whatever they want. But some people are saying that he's just using free speech as an excuse. Like what he really wants is to make those conservative users happy and maybe even get more people engaged, even if it means more misinformation and more danger for certain groups.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, we all believe in free speech, right? It's a fundamental part of a democracy. We should be able to express ourselves, share our ideas without being censored. But at the same time, we know that words can have real-world consequences. Like hate speech can lead to violence and false information can, I don't know, it can undermine our institutions. It's tricky.
It really is. It's like, how do we find that balance? Where does free speech end and harm begin? And it feels like that line is getting blurrier and blurrier, especially online.
It is. And these platforms, they're not helping. I mean, their algorithms are designed to keep people engaged, right? And a lot of times the stuff that gets the most engagement is the stuff that's, well, the most outrageous, the most divisive, and that just creates more space for misinformation and hate to spread.
So it's like, even if we want to be responsible, even if we try to be careful about what we share and what we believe, the system is almost working against us.
Yeah, in a way. It's like we're all swimming in this ocean of information, and it's getting harder and harder to tell which way is up.
And that has just made it even harder by taking away those fact-checking life preservers.
They have. And it's not just about individuals trying to figure things out on their own. It's also about our society as a whole. Like, if we can't even agree on basic facts, how are we supposed to have meaningful conversations about the important stuff? The things that affect all of us.
It's like we're all living in our own little bubbles, our own echo chambers, and those bubbles are drifting further and further apart.
And Meta's decision, well, it just feels like it's pushing those bubbles even further apart.
It's a scary thought. Like, are
Yeah.
we heading towards a world where there's no shared reality anymore? Where everyone just believes whatever they want to believe, regardless of the facts?
It's a possibility, and it's one we need to fight against.
But how? I mean, it feels like a losing battle sometimes.
It's not easy, but I think it starts with being more aware, more critical. Question everything. Don't just accept what you see at face value. Check your sources. Think about who's sharing information and why.
Be your own fact checker.
In a way, yeah. But it's also about being open to different perspectives, listening to people who disagree with you, trying to understand where they're coming from.
And remembering that we're all human, that we all make mistakes, and that it's okay to change our minds when presented with new information.
Exactly. We need more humility, more empathy, and more willingness to engage in good faith conversations, even when they're tough.
Okay? So we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about Zuckerberg and his motivations, the oversight board and their worries, the impact on vulnerable communities, the politics of it all, the whole free speech versus misinformation debate. And, we even talked about money. It's clear that Meta's decision is a big deal. It's complicated, and it has the potential to change things in a lot of ways.
It does. And it's a story that's still unfolding. Who knows what the long-term consequences will be?
No one knows for sure. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some tools to help you navigate this crazy online world we live in.
We hope so. Because we all need to be more informed, more engaged, more critical.
Absolutely. Now, before we go, I want to leave you with one final question. It's a big one, but it's one that we all need to be asking ourselves. Imagine you're in charge of Meta. You're calling the shots. How would you balance the need for free speech with the need to protect users from harm? How would you stop the spread of misinformation without censoring legitimate voices? It's a tough question, but it's one that we all need to be thinking about.
It is, because the future of our online world, and maybe even our democracy, depends on finding the right answers.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.